So we've looked a lot about radioactive atoms and the types of radiation they can release. And now we're going to look at different uses for radioactive chemicals, because we found radiation to be used for a lot of different applications. So remembering from last video, here's a graph showing the decay of a radioactive element. And this one's showing carbon-14. And remember, we can measure that the time it takes for half of those atoms in your carbon-14 to decay, that's called the half-life. So if we follow the graph down from 50%, we can see the half-life here of carbon-14 is about 6,000 years. It's actually about 5,700 years. And one of the best uses for particularly using radioactive carbon-14, is called radiometric dating. That's the proper scientific name. The common name you might have heard is just called carbon dating. So radio meaning radioactive, and metric meaning we're measuring using it. So radiometric dating, this uses carbon-14, and we use the half-life of it to figure out the age of different materials. To find the age of materials. And often it's different artifacts that archaeologists discover. So things like human remains. We've got some bones found here, and other things like written scrolls. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Which are really important text for humanity, because they're the oldest surviving copy of the Bible that we've discovered. So archaeologists and scientists, they used carbon dating to figure out the age of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we can use it for different things, anywhere up to 50,000 years, approximately. And the way they do it is, it only works for living things, firstly. Or not living things, but things that were once living. So we can say biological material. So things like wood, paper, and bones and teeth. It works for all of those. And once something dies, the carbon-14 in that living thing is no longer being recycled. So as soon as something dies, we can think of it as the radioactive clock begins. So we start with 100% of the carbon-14, and then we know, because of the half-life of carbon-14, that 5,700 years later, there'll only be half the amount of carbon-14. And we also know how much carbon-14 there is in nature normally. So we know the percentage of carbon-14. So what we can do is, when we find an artifact, we can test that material. So they tested a small piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they figure out how much percent of the carbon-14 is there that's left compared to the starting amount that there should be. And for the Dead Sea Scrolls, they worked them out that they had about 70% of the carbon-14 left. And now, because we have our graph that's always the same, we can measure down from 70%, and they came out with a number of about 2,200 years. So because of the fact that carbon decays and we can predict it, we actually were able to figure out that these scrolls were made about 2000 BC. So they're well over 2,000 years old. The one problem with carbon dating, though, is the limit we can see here is about 50,000 years. Because after that, all of the carbon-14 has decayed away. But the positive is that there are many other radioactive elements that we can actually use. So, other radioactive elements can be used for older samples. Things like potassium and uranium, they have a half-life that's millions of years. So we can even identify the age of different fossils, like this one up here. There are a couple of other uses that are also really common for radioactive materials. And these are obviously nuclear weapons, which is always a difficult subject, and nuclear energy as well, which is safer, but, well, obviously it's safer than a nuclear weapon, but it's very controversial as well. So the way that both of these processes work is we use radioactive atoms still, but we use a phenomenon or a fact that's called a chain reaction. And a nuclear chain reaction happens because when we start with one radioactive atom, it will decay, and then the radiation that comes from that decay, it actually hits another atom and causes that one to break apart. And then that atom suddenly causes some other atoms to break apart. So we have a chain reaction. So instead of the atoms waiting randomly to decay, like normal, we have the radiation that's released from one atom causes other ones to decay. And remember, whenever atoms are breaking apart and decaying, there's energy that's being produced. So in a chain reaction, there's lots and lots of energy being made. And that's how these processes, the energy is what these processes use. So nuclear energy, it uses the energy to heat water and then spin a turbine to make power. So it takes that energy from a chain reaction to generate power. Nuclear weapons, on the other hand, they use all that energy to release all at the same time and create an explosion. So we have found lots of important and beneficial uses for radioactive chemicals.